In the spring of 2019, a man named Del Pruitt drove his pickup truck 40 miles east of Harrisburg into Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, to look at a barn fire. He had not started it. He had heard about it on the radio the way you hear about a lot of things in rural counties, over the scanner, between weather reports, and he went not to help with the fire, but because barns that burn, if the owner will let you walk the aftermath, sometimes give up things that no one knew were inside them. Del was 53 years old, and he had been doing this for 22 years. He was known for two things: the patience it took to go where others saw only ash, and an eye for lithographed tin that had not dulled in 2 decades of looking. He paid the farmer $250 for a scorched sign he pulled from a collapsed beam section near the rear of the granary. The farmer took the money without much interest. Most of what stood was rubble. The sign was roughly 18 inches by 30, coated in soot, with one corner bent back from heat stress, and the farmer did not know what it was. What Del saw that morning in April 2019 would take him the better part of a year to fully understand. And when he did, that sign did not sit in his collection. It went to a room in New York City, where a man in a well-cut jacket set it under a light and said nothing for a very long time. The figure on the invoice that came back to Lebanon County was $41,000. The farmer who took the $250 never learned that number, but 3 of his neighbors did, because Del told them himself. He did not tell them to brag. He told them because they had things in their own barns that they did not know how to look at, and he thought they deserved to know that looking was a skill that could be learned. This is the story of how Del Pruitt learned it, and what it cost him to hold on to it, when the people around him were very sure he was wrong. Del grew up in Dauphin County, 20 miles west of where the sign would eventually surface, in a house his grandfather built from a kit he ordered out of a catalog in 1931. His grandfather was a pressman at a printing plant in Harrisburg, a man who understood lithography the way a lot of men of that generation understood their trade, not from a textbook, but from the physical act of doing it for 40 years. He used to say that a good lithograph was made to outlast the product it advertised because the product was seasonal and the tin was permanent. He meant it as a practical observation about materials. Del would spend most of his adult life discovering it was also a prophecy. Del did not start out as a collector. He started out as a roofer, which meant he spent a great deal of time near the upper portions of barns and farmhouses and outbuildings across 5 counties, and the things that accumulated in those upper portions were a kind of education no university offered. In 1997, when he was 27, he pulled a stack of old feed sacks from a hayloft in Perry County while he was up there checking flashing, and the farmer told him to keep them or burn them. He took them home. He spread them across his kitchen table and spent a Saturday morning looking at them, and the graphic quality of the printed labels, the lettering style, the illustration conventions, the specific colors that lithographic printing achieved in certain decades, struck him as something he wanted to understand. He started reading. Then he started buying. He bought cheap at first, and badly, the way everyone does. He paid money for things that turned out to be reproductions, and he paid money for things that turned out to be damaged beyond what he understood at the time. The early years were an education in how to lose money carefully. He drove to swap meats in Cumberland and York and Perry counties and set pieces on the hood of his truck in the morning light, and looked at them with a magnifying glass he bought at a hardware store, trying to read what the surface told him. A reproduction was printed, not fused, and if you wet the corner and pressed your fingernail, you could sometimes feel the ink come up. Genuine lithography resisted that. Genuine lithography had a particular hardness under the fingernail and a color depth you could see at an angle that went away when you looked straight on. He did not understand any of this at first. He understood it after 40 or 50 mistakes. He kept notes in a spiral-bound notebook, not a journal, just observations, date and location and what he paid and what the piece turned out to be and why. His grandfather had kept a notebook like that at the plant, a log of press settings and ink mixtures and paper tolerances. And Dell used the same kind of notebook for the same reason, because if you did not write down what you observed, you eventually forgot the nuance of what you had seen. The notebooks were his catalog, in the way that a field naturalist's journal is a catalog, specific to the territory he was actually walking, not to the territory someone else had mapped. He had a dog in those years, a border collie mix named Hatch, who rode in the cab and waited in the lot, while Dell worked the tables and came back to the truck with boxes and sometimes with nothing. Hatch would put his chin on the cardboard flap and smell what was inside. Dell told him once that the dog probably had as good a nose for old tin as anyone at the swap meets. He may not have been entirely joking. By 2004, he had stopped buying badly. By 2008, he had a reputation in a small circle of dealers along the Northeast Corridor as someone who found genuine pieces in genuinely unusual places and who would not inflate a condition report. He was not wealthy. He still roofed. He was, all the same, developing something that the professional auction circuit, which ran on catalog valuations and comparable sales and peer consensus, had not yet developed, which was a sense of what had survived in barns that had never been cataloged in the first place. Let me tell you about lithographed tin, because if you do not understand it, you cannot understand what Dell was doing or why the man in New York City eventually paid what he did. Lithographic tin advertising signs were manufactured in large quantities in the United States between roughly 1890 and 1950, printed on heavy gauge steel sheets using an oil-based ink process that fused color directly to the metal surface under heat and pressure. The process was not cheap. Companies that commissioned these signs were buying a form of advertising intended to outlast wooden boards and paper posters by decades. The earliest pieces used a limited palette, because the lithographic press could only lay down one color per pass, and each pass cost money. A 4-color sign was expensive. A 6-color sign was a luxury. The number of colors in a sign was therefore a rough indicator of how seriously the company that made it was spending and what decade it came from. What made barn signs interesting, specifically, was the storage condition. A sign that had hung outdoors on a post or a storefront facade for 50 years was usually sun-bleached and surface oxidized beyond much value. A sign that had ended up in a barn, behind a beam, or nailed to an interior wall or used as a patch for a hole in the siding, could come out in condition that defied reason. The barn's interior shielded it from ultraviolet light. Temperature variation was slow. Humidity inside a well-built stone and timber barn, which was the dominant construction type in central Pennsylvania from the mid-19th century forward, was relatively stable. The sign that hung on a post in the sun for 30 years looked 100 years old. The sign that sat behind a beam in a stone bank barn, in the dark, for 80 years looked almost new. Dell understood this, and most of the professional auction circuit did not, or more precisely, the circuit understood it abstractly, but did not go into barns the way Dell went into barns. He knew where the stone bank barns were. He had spent 22 years roofing them. He was at a swap meet in York County in late 2010, sorting through a pile of farm hardware, when a dealer named Carson Briggs stopped beside him. Carson had been in the antique advertising business since the mid-1980s, operating out of a shop on the main street of a tourist town near Lancaster. And he had twice been photographed for the cover of a regional antiques magazine. He was 61 years old, with a degree in art history from a college in Ohio, and he believed in the catalog. If a piece was not in the reference catalogs, it had likely been reproduced, or it was a regional variant of little consequence, or it was simply not worth the uncertainty. Carson picked up the same feed sack Dell was looking at and set it back down. "You're Pruitt," he said. "I've heard about you." Dell said he supposed he was. "You buy a lot of things out of barns," Carson said. It was not a compliment. The tone was the tone of someone describing a method that was, in their considered professional opinion, a hobby. Dell said that was right. Carson told him in a friendly enough way that barn material was unpredictable, that provenance was nearly impossible to establish without documentation, that the absence of catalog reference was itself a red flag, and that any serious dealer would confirm those concerns. He gestured at Dell's truck, which had 3 cardboard boxes in the bed covered with a tarp. "Whatever you've got in those boxes," Carson said, smiling, "I hope you're not paying too much for them." Dell thanked him for the advice and did not open the boxes. He thought about that conversation for longer than he expected to. Not because it wounded him, but because Carson was not entirely wrong, and Dell knew it. Barn material was unpredictable. Provenance was difficult. The catalog was the catalog for a reason, which was that the people who built it had looked at thousands of pieces and made thousands of comparisons and arrived at something dependable. Dell was working from observation and from the notebooks, and he was working at the edges of what the catalogs had mapped. He was also finding things the catalogs had not seen. In the summer of 2012, he pulled a sign from a barn in Cumberland County that the farmer was tearing down to put in a solar array. The sign was oil company advertising, pre-war, with a winged eagle motif in the upper left corner and a county route number in the address panel that Dell recognized as a routing convention used in the 1920s. The farmer had it propped against a corn crib and said he was going to take it to the metal recycler with the rest of the old roofing. Dell paid him $40 and put it in the truck. When Dell cleaned it and photographed it and sent the photographs to 3 dealers he trusted, none of them recognized the regional variant. It was not in the standard reference. He spent 8 months tracking down who had printed it, using the lithographic housemarks in the lower margin, a small diamond-shaped cartouche with a press code inside it, and eventually located a press record in a library archive in Pittsburgh that confirmed the sign had been produced in a run of 800 for a chain of fuel depots that had operated only in 4 central Pennsylvania counties between 1923 and 1936. It was not a famous sign. It was local, narrow, and deeply specific. A dealer at a major auction house in Philadelphia looked at his photographs and told him, politely, that regional variants without catalog presence were very difficult to place. The dealer's exact phrase was that the market had not found it yet, which Dell understood as a polite way of saying that the market might not find it at all. Dell sold it to a collector in Virginia for $11,000. The collector had been looking for exactly that sign for 9 years. He had advertised in 3 trade publications without result. He heard about Dell through a dealer in Maryland who had passed on the piece and given Dell's name. The collector drove to Lebanon County and stood at Dell's workbench and held the sign at arm's length in the morning light for a long time without speaking. Then he set it down and wrote a check. He wrote that outcome in his notebook. He wrote it next to the Cumberland County barn address, and the date he found it, and the date he sold it, and the amount the regional variant caveat had cost him in dealer interest and gained him in direct sale. He was beginning to understand something that the catalog system, for all its reliability, could not fully capture, which was that the pieces most worth finding were precisely the ones the catalog had not yet found. The catalog was a record of previous discovery. It was not a map of what remained. If the catalog knew a piece, so did every buyer and every dealer. The pieces the catalog did not know were pieces that required someone to go find them first. Someone willing to drive 40 miles on a Tuesday because a barn was on fire. It was this understanding that made him drive east toward Lebanon County on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, because he heard on the scanner that an old bank barn was burning. The property had been in the same family since 1887. The current owner, a man named Floyd, was 68 and had inherited the operation from his father, who had inherited it from his. Floyd raised beef cattle on 40 acres and rented out the remaining cropland. The barn that burned had not been used actively since the 1970s, when Floyd's father consolidated the operation into a newer concrete block building closer to the road. The old stone and timber barn had become a kind of storage gravity well, the place where things that were not quite worthless but were not quite useful ended up. Dell walked the site after the fire crew cleared it. Floyd watched him from the lane, arms crossed, not unfriendly, but not curious either. The granary section at the rear of the barn had not fully burned. The timber had charred and the roof had collapsed, but the stone walls still stood, and within them, under a collapsed purlin, Dell found what he would later determine was a 6-color, lithographed tin sign advertising a regional dairy cooperative that had operated in Lebanon County between 1903 and 1939. The sign had likely been nailed to the interior of the granary wall at some point in the 1920s and had then been covered by shelving, which had collapsed over decades and buried it under a layer of rotted wood and chaff. The heat from the fire had popped the shelving clear and exposed the sign. He could not read it yet. It was coated in soot, and one corner was bent. He could see color beneath the soot, and he could see the lithographic border treatment, which was distinctive in a way that made something in his chest go still and careful. He offered Floyd $250 in cash. Floyd looked at the sign, looked at Dell, and took the money. He had 17 other things to deal with that morning. Dell drove home. He set the sign on his workbench under a good light and began the process he had used for 22 years, which began with a soft brush and distilled water and patience. He did not rush the cleaning because you could not rush it. The surface of a lithographed tin sign is not a coat of paint. It is a fused layer, and what looked like soot could sometimes be heat damage, and heat damage came off differently than soot, and if you pushed too hard, you pushed through the color layer underneath. He worked for 3 hours on the first afternoon. He stopped when he could make out the central illustration, clearly enough to know what he was looking at. The illustration showed a milkmaid and a range of hills, and a breed of cattle Dell recognized as a type no longer common in Pennsylvania, a dual-purpose breed that had largely been replaced by Holstein-dominant stock by the mid-20th century. The lettering style and the border treatment were consistent with a lithographic print house in Baltimore that had done a significant amount of agricultural advertising work in the early part of the century. The color register, the precision with which 6 separate ink layers had been laid down in alignment, was exceptional. Dell had seen a lot of early lithography. He had not often seen registration this clean on a piece of this age. He spent the next 2 weeks in the library. He drove to the county seat and requested the agricultural cooperative records from the first decades of the century. And a librarian brought him 4 boxes of ledger books and annual reports that no one had touched in decades. He read through them in 2-hour sessions, looking for the cooperative's name. He found it in a 1907 formation document, 17 founding member farms listed by acreage and location, all within a 12-mile radius of the Lebanon County seat. He found it in a 1919 membership renewal, 42 farms by then. He found a reference to a promotional campaign in a 1924 annual report that mentioned signage commissioned for distribution to member farms and to 2 regional grocery chains. He found an advertisement in a digitized copy of a Lebanon County newspaper from 1924 that reproduced, in black and white, an image that matched the central illustration on the sign with enough fidelity to confirm the connection. The newspaper advertisement was for a summer dairy promotion, and at the bottom it credited the cooperative by its full legal name. He printed the page. He held the printout next to the clean section of the sign and the alignment of the milkmaid figure, the hill profile in the background, and the cattle breed visible in the right quarter matched on every major element. He found no catalog reference. He found no auction record. He found no indication that any piece from this cooperative's advertising campaign had ever surfaced publicly. The cooperative had dissolved in 1939, when the dairy industry's consolidation swept through the region and the small member farms found they could not negotiate favorable terms against the large processing plants moving into the county from the east. The records ended there. The signs had gone wherever signs went when the entity that made them ceased to exist, into barns, into outbuildings, into the slow dark where things that are not quite worthless but are not quite useful end up. He took the photographs to Carson Briggs in late May. He also took the newspaper printout and the relevant page from the 1924 annual report. He brought everything he had found because he wanted Carson to see the whole picture. Carson looked at the photographs for a long time. He looked at the newspaper reproduction Dell had printed. He looked at the condition photographs, the close-ups of the color register and the lithographic border. "It's regional," Carson said finally. "No catalog presence. Could be one of a kind, could be from a run of 500. You have no way to know. No auction record means no market comp. You're asking someone to take a chance on a piece that has no established value." He handed the photographs back. "It's a nice barn find," Carson said. "I'd put it at 800, maybe 1,200 at a stretch. It's a hobby piece." Dell thanked him and drove home. He sent the photographs to 7 collectors over the next 6 weeks. 3 did not respond. 2 responded to say they agreed with the regional variant problem. One said she thought the piece was interesting, but that without catalog presence, she could not justify the price Dell was considering. One, a man named Ike Holt, who dealt in pre-war agricultural advertising from a barn he had converted to a gallery outside Charlottesville, Virginia, said he had not seen this cooperative's material before and asked Dell what he wanted for it. Dell said he wanted time to understand what he had before he put a number on it. Ike said he respected that. Dell spent the rest of the summer working, not on the sign, but on the history around it. He found the name of the lithographic print house in the Baltimore City Directory for 1921, a firm that had operated out of a building near the harbor and had specialized, according to a brief notice in a 1919 printing trade journal, in agricultural and mercantile advertising for mid-Atlantic regional clients. The firm had closed in 1932. Its surviving records had been donated in the 1970s by the founder's grandson to a Maryland Historical Society. Dell drove to Maryland on a Thursday in July. The archivist brought him 4 clamshell boxes and told him the collection had not been fully processed. Dell thanked her and worked through the boxes in order. In the 3rd box, he found a partial client ledger from 1923 and 1924. On a page dated July of 1924, in handwriting small and regular enough to suggest a clerk who did this work every day, he found a line item for the Lebanon County Dairy Cooperative. The entry specified a quantity of 420 signs and a delivery date of September 1924. Dell photographed every page of the relevant ledger section. He checked each photograph against the original before turning the page. 420. A specific number, a delivery date, a client name. He had found the provenance, he had found the run size, then he found something else. In the same collection, in a different box, he found a bundle of trade publications from the late 1920s, bound with a rubber band that crumbled when he touched it. One publication from 1928 covered a regional exhibition of lithographic advertising art held in Baltimore that spring. In the exhibition's featured section, the reviewer had reproduced the central illustration from a sign that Dell recognized before he read a single word of the caption. The milkmaid, the hills, the cattle in the right quarter. The reviewer described the illustration as one of the finer examples of agricultural idealism in mid-Atlantic commercial lithography and praised the color registration as exceptional for a 6-pass piece commissioned at the price point typical of regional cooperative clients. The sign had been exhibited. It had been reviewed in print. It was documented by a source that predated by 90 years any interest Dell might have in the outcome. He sat in the archive reading room for a moment after he photographed the page. The archivist was at her desk across the room. Dell did not say anything to her. He simply put the publication back in the box in the order he had found it, and started on the 4th box. Because there was still time before they closed, and he was not the kind of man to stop working in the middle of an afternoon. His granddaughter was visiting that September a 20-year-old named Paige who was studying communications at Penn State and who had been, for most of her young life, skeptical of what her grandfather did for a living. Not unkind about it, just skeptical in the way that people who are studying for credentials in a credentialed world become skeptical of methods that do not look like the methods they are being taught. She sat at the kitchen table while Dell spread out his archive copies and explained what he had found. "But if it's that good," she said, "why didn't the guy in Lancaster know it?" Dell said that was the right question. He thought about it for a moment. "Because the catalog knows what's been sold," he said. "It doesn't know what's been sitting in barns." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "But how do you know what's worth finding? If the catalog doesn't have it, how do you know?" He pointed at the notebooks on the shelf. 22 years of them, spiral-bound, the spines labeled by county and year. He said he had written down everything he had seen and everything he had been wrong about. He said the notebooks were not a catalog. They were a record of looking. She picked one up and turned pages without reading closely, the way you do when you are trying to understand the shape of something rather than its contents. Then she set it back. She came back in October. She brought a friend from her program who was writing a feature article for the school paper on informal knowledge economies, and Dell showed them both around the workbench and answered questions for an hour. The friend asked about market valuation methodology. Dell said the methodology was looking. The friend wrote that down with an expression that suggested she found it less useful than she had hoped. Paige came back in November without the friend. She sat at the kitchen table while Dell cleaned a piece he had found the week before, a farm equipment sign from Lancaster County, and she watched him work with the brush and the distilled water. She asked what he was looking for in the border treatment. He explained about the registration marks. The tiny crosshair, printed in the margin by the lithographic press to align successive color passes, and how the quality of the registration told you something about how the print house had been operating and when. She asked if he ever got it wrong anymore. He said he got it wrong less often than he used to, and he still got it wrong sometimes. She asked how he knew when he had gotten it wrong. He said usually someone told him. Or he went back to the notebooks and found the place where he had made the same mistake before, and not learned from it the first time. She asked better questions each time. The market collapse Dell had been watching for 2 years arrived, if you could call it that, in the summer and fall of 2023. Not as a single event, but as a slow structural shift in how the mid-tier antique advertising market was behaving. Rising interest rates had tightened discretionary spending. The major auction houses reported softening hammer prices on mid-century country store material. 3 dealers Dell knew personally had closed their shops or gone to online-only operations, which reduced the overhead but also reduced the floor space and the prestige and the kind of walk-in discovery that sustained the secondary market. The buyers who remained were buying more carefully and spending more only on pieces with unambiguous pedigree and catalog presence. Carson Briggs, who Dell had run into twice more since 2010, was still open. Carson had positioned himself well in catalog-confirmed material, and his clientele was stable. When Dell saw him at an auction preview in early 2024, Carson mentioned that he had passed on 3 barn finds that year that he would have looked at more seriously a decade earlier. The market, he said, did not reward uncertainty right now. Buyers wanted documentation. They wanted catalog. A collector Dell knew in York County had spent $90,000 in 2021 on a collection of catalog-confirmed petroleum advertising signs, borrowing against equity to do it. By late 2023, comparable pieces at auction were bringing 60 to 70 cents on the dollar. The debt was not crushing, but it was uncomfortable, and he had 3 pieces he could not move at the prices he needed. He was managing, just managing. Dell had not borrowed. He had not scaled up. He had kept the operation the same size it had always been, a pickup truck and 22 years of notebooks and the ability to go where the fires were. His overhead was low because his method was narrow, and narrow meant he could not buy in volume, but it also meant that a market softening did not touch him the same way it touched people whose volume required them to turn pieces quickly. He had been sitting on the Lebanon County sign for 4.5 years. Ike Holt called him in December of 2023. He said he had been thinking about the sign for a while. He had a client who had been collecting pre-war agricultural advertising from the mid-Atlantic region for 15 years, documented pieces only, and Ike had mentioned the Lebanon County sign to him the previous spring as something that might eventually come available. The client had asked Ike to follow up. Ike said the trade publication review Dell had found was the piece that changed the picture. Documented exhibition, professional critical assessment, a client ledger that established the run size. That was a provenance chain most barn material never approached. He asked if Dell was ready to put a number on it. Dell said he thought so. He said he had a 6-color lithographed tin sign from a documented run of 420, produced by a Baltimore lithography firm in September 1924 for a regional dairy cooperative. He said the piece had been exhibited in Baltimore 4 years after production, and reviewed in print. He said the physical condition was consistent with interior barn storage across the full span of its existence, which meant it had preserved in a manner nearly unattainable for outdoor or commercial display pieces of the period. He said he thought the number should reflect all of that. Ike said he agreed that it should. Dell said 45,000. The line was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man doing arithmetic, but the quiet of a man deciding whether to start a negotiation or conclude one. "I'll take it to him," Ike said. He came back in 3 days. The client had looked at the documentation Dell had assembled and come back at 41,000. He was not negotiating the value downward, Ike explained. He was negotiating toward what he had budgeted for the piece when he first heard about it and had not revised the figure since. Dell said 41 was acceptable. It was not the number he had asked for. It was a number that accounted for 4.5 years of looking and 8 months of archive work and 22 years of knowing which barns to go into after fires. $41,000. Ike drove to Lebanon County on a Tuesday. He carried the sign out to his van, wrapped in archival tissue, and set it in a wooden crate he had brought for it. He handed Dell the invoice copy. Dell looked at the figure printed on it and set it on the workbench next to the notebooks. He did not frame it. He did not photograph it for social media. He put the invoice in the folder with the archive copies from Maryland and the newspaper photograph and the ledger page, and he put the folder on the shelf. Paige drove down from State College that weekend. She was 24 now and finishing her degree in the spring, and she had been thinking for most of the fall semester about what she wanted to do with it. She sat at the kitchen table, and Dell told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. "You held it for 4.5 years, she said. He said he had. "And you found it in a fire." He said the fire was what let him see it in a way. She asked if she could look at the notebooks again. Not flip through them this time. Read them. He told her they were on the shelf. He told her to take whatever time she needed. Carson Briggs heard the sale figure from Ike Holt 6 weeks later, because that is how information moves in a small trade. Dell ran into Carson at a show in Lancaster in February. Carson was standing at a table of catalog-confirmed petroleum signs, the kind of material he had built his reputation on. He looked at Dell for a moment. 41, he said. It was not a question. Dell said that was the number. Carson was quiet. He looked down at the table, then back up. "I didn't know that Cooperative's material had ever been reviewed," he said. Dell said it had been in 1928 in Baltimore. "I would have looked harder," Carson said. He meant it plainly, without self-pity. He was a good-faith man who operated inside a system he had spent 40 years learning to trust. He had been wrong, in this particular case, about where the edges of the system were. "You could start going into barns," Dell said. Carson considered this with the look of someone who understood it was a genuine offer. "I'm 64, he said. "So start now," Dell said. He was not unkind about it. In the spring of 2024, Dell drove out to Floyd's property with a check for $2,000 and an explanation. Floyd was in the lane when Dell pulled up, working on a gate hinge with a wrench. He looked at the check and looked at Dell. "The sign," Dell said. Floyd took the check. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket without looking at the figure. He asked what Dell had gotten for it. Dell told him. Floyd was quiet for a moment and then said something under his breath that was not directed at Dell, more at the general situation, the way a man talks to himself when a fact about the world has shifted slightly on its axis, and he needs a moment to absorb the new position. His neighbor, a man named Vern, who kept a few beef cattle on the adjacent parcel, had come down the lane while they were talking, the way neighbors in that part of the county materialize when there is a vehicle in a neighbor's lane that has not been there before. Vern was 62, weathered, skeptical of most things presented to him, without adequate time for consideration. He stood at the edge of the lane and listened. Dell told both of them what to look for. He said the principle was simple, which was that a barn that had stood for a long time was not an absence of value, but a preservation environment, and what it had preserved depended on what had gone in and how much time had passed. He said the stone and timber bank barns of central Pennsylvania were among the finest unintentional preservation environments for certain categories of printed and manufactured material that existed anywhere in the country. And the people who understood that were still, relative to the number of barns standing, very few. He said the main thing was not to throw anything away before letting him see it, because the things that looked most like trash were sometimes the things that had been sitting longest undisturbed, and age was the variable that mattered. Vern asked what kinds of things. Dell said tin signs were the obvious category, but also paper lithography, seed catalogs, farm equipment manuals with original illustrated covers, certain categories of hand-painted wooden trade signs from the 19th century, glass advertising pieces, and cast-iron hardware with makers' marks from firms that no longer existed. He said none of it was guaranteed. He said most of what he looked at was not worth what it took to look at it. He said the times it was worth it were what made the looking worthwhile. He gave Floyd his card. He gave Vern his card. Vern looked at the card and then looked at his outbuildings across the field, two of them, a granary from the 1890s and a tobacco shed from some time before the war, in the way that people look at familiar things after someone has suggested they might contain something unfamiliar. That summer, Paige finished her degree and came home to Lebanon County. She did not get the media job she had applied for in Philadelphia. She worked for a month at a marketing agency in Harrisburg and resigned after 6 weeks. She drove out to Dell's place on a Saturday in August with the spiral notebook she had borrowed in December, the one from 1999, and she set it on the kitchen table and said she thought she wanted to learn how to do this. Dell looked at her for a moment. He said it was not a career the way her degree had been described as a career. She said she understood that. He said there was no catalog for what she was about to try to learn. She said she knew. He pulled the notebooks off the shelf, all 27 of them at that point, and set them on the table in front of her. He said, start at the beginning and write down what she noticed, not what she thought the observations meant. What she noticed. He said the meaning came later, after enough observations, that the pattern was bigger than any single instance. She opened the first notebook. He went to put the coffee on. She came back the following Saturday. She came back the Saturday after that. By October, she was going with him to look at barns. She asked good questions. She made mistakes. She wrote the mistakes down. Two kinds of knowing exist in this world, and they are not the same kind, and confusing them costs something. One kind is wide and cumulative, built on what has been recorded, sold, compared, and cataloged, and it is reliable in its domain and necessary for the market to function, and the people who hold it are not wrong to trust it. The other kind is narrow and earned, built observation by observation in specific rooms and specific buildings, organized not by what others have verified, but by what you have seen with your own eyes enough times to know the pattern, and it has no entry in the reference books because the reference books, by definition, catalog what has already been found. The first kind knows the price of what has been sold. The second kind knows where to look for what has not. The sign from the burning barn is in a climate-controlled room in Manhattan now. It is behind glass. The documentation is in an archival sleeve beside it. Del Pruitt's name is on the provenance record because Ike Holt wrote it there, the way these things are supposed to be written, and the ledger page from Baltimore, the one Del photographed in a Maryland Historical Society, is reproduced in the file. On a workbench in Lebanon County, there is a spiral notebook with a new first entry. It is written in a hand that is not Del's. The entry reads the same way every entry in every one of the notebooks. Before it reads date and location, and what was paid and what it turned out to be and why. The observation at the end is short. It says, barn-stored lithographed tin preserves differently than outdoor-hung tin. Look for shelving collapse. The piece is often underneath. What the catalog cannot hold is what hands have to learn. That is what the fire let him see.